Otis Redding had a set list. He always had a set list. His shows were built with the precision of someone who understood that a great performance was not accidental. It was constructed, song by song, moment by moment, with the complete intention of a man who took the architecture of an evening seriously. His band knew this. His road manager knew this. The people who traveled with Otis Redding knew that the set list was not a suggestion, but a blueprint, and that deviating from it mid-tour, mid-week, mid-evening was not something that happened. On this particular night, somewhere on a mid-1960s package tour, Otis Redding changed his set list 40 minutes before he was supposed to go on. To understand what that meant, why the band looked at each other the way they did, why the road manager asked twice whether he was certain, it helps to understand who Otis Redding was and what his relationship to performance looked like from the inside. By the mid-1960s, Otis Redding was in the process of becoming one of the most important figures in American soul music, though the full recognition of this would not be complete until after his death. He was 23, 24 years old, and he sang with a physical intensity that audiences received as a kind of direct contact, not a performance observed from a distance, but an experience shared, something that happened to the room rather than in front of it. His voice was not smooth in the way that some soul voices are smooth. It was rough at the edges in a way that was not accidental, a roughness that communicated urgency, that told an audience, this is not controlled, this is not managed, this is a person whose relationship to the song is too immediate to be kept clean. He was also, underneath the emotional intensity of the performance, a careful craftsman. The roughness was real, but it was placed with great precision. He knew where the edge of the performance was and how to stay on it without going over, how to create the impression of abandon within a structure that was actually rigorously controlled. The set list was part of that control, the plan that made the apparent spontaneity possible. That night, Etta James was closing the first half of the bill. He had heard her before, on this same tour and others, had been in the same buildings, shared the same stages in the sequence that package tours produced. He respected her. He had told people as much, in the offhand way that musicians acknowledged each other, when the acknowledgement was genuine and didn't require elaboration. But he had not, until this particular night, been standing in the right place at the right moment to see what Etta James did when everything aligned. He went to his road manager 20 minutes before his set was supposed to begin. What he said was brief. He was moving 2 songs from the end of the set to the middle, and he was opening with something slower than planned. The road manager wrote it down. He went to the band. The band received this information with the particular professionalism of musicians who have been on tour long enough to accept changes to the plan without requiring an explanation, though several of them exchanged looks that communicated what they weren't saying aloud. Otis Redding did not explain the change. He did not have a fully formed explanation to give. The change was instinctive, a response to something he had heard, rather than a conclusion he had reasoned his way toward. What he understood, standing in the wing while Etta James was still finishing her set, was that he had been opening his shows with everything he had, all at once, for reasons that had to do with his specific gifts and his specific relationship to performance. And that approach worked. The audiences responded. The shows were good. But they peaked early. The opening gave everything, and the rest of the set had to sustain a level that had been established before the audience had fully arrived at the evening. He could feel this sometimes in the middle of a set, the slight sense that the room had already reached the place it was going to reach, and was now riding a plateau rather than climbing. Not a failure, not even a problem by most definitions, but a ceiling. What Etta James had done, over the course of the 40 minutes he had been watching her, was refuse the ceiling. She had not started at the top. She had started somewhere real, and then kept moving, kept finding the next level, kept giving the audience something they hadn't anticipated, kept making the second half of the set feel more necessary than the first. She had built a room that was more alive at the end of the 40 minutes than it had been at the beginning. He went on stage. The set that Otis Redding played that night was, by the accounts of the musicians who were on that tour, different from the sets that had come before it on the same circuit. Not dramatically, not in ways that would have been visible to an audience attending for the first time, but perceptibly different in pace, in architecture, in the timing of the moments when he gave the most and the moments when he held something back. He opened slower. He built deliberately. He let the room come to him rather than going fully at the room in the first 30 seconds. By the final song, the audience was somewhere that the opening night audiences on that tour had not been. The road manager noticed it. The band noticed it. And Otis Redding, standing at the microphone at the end of the set, receiving what the room was giving back, noticed it too. Etta James's closing set that night was the kind that happened when circumstances aligned in ways that couldn't be predicted or repeated. Not the transcendent nights when the distance between her and the song disappeared entirely. Those were rarer, and this wasn't quite that. What this was a night when the architecture of her performance was fully visible, when you could hear not just the result, but the construction, the way she built each song from the inside, the decisions she was making in real time about where to go and how fast to get there. For a general audience, this experience was moving without being analyzable. They felt what was happening without necessarily understanding the mechanism. They responded the way audiences respond to great performances, with the particular silence that means everyone has stopped thinking and started feeling, followed by the kind of applause that means they knew something real had happened, even if they couldn't say what. For Otis Redding, standing in the wing, the experience was something more specific. He could hear the mechanism. He could hear where she was choosing to apply pressure and where she was choosing to release, where the phrasing was doing something unexpected, where the song was being pushed in a direction it hadn't been designed to go and was holding up under the pressure. He could hear the craft, not because the craft was visible, it wasn't. She wasn't showing her work, but because he had enough of his own craft to recognize what it looked like from the outside when someone was doing it at this level. What he was hearing was a different relationship to the song than the one he had. Otis Redding's relationship to a song was frontal. He came at it directly, with everything he had, from the first note, immediate, present, total. There was no distance between him and the material, no scaffolding, no management of the energy. He gave it all at once, and the giving was the performance. It was an extraordinary approach. It produced extraordinary results. It also, he understood as he stood in the wing listening to Etta James, foreclosed certain possibilities. What Etta was doing was different. She was not frontal. She moved around the song, approached it from one angle, pulled back, approached from another, let the audience think they knew where she was going, and then went somewhere else. She was in no hurry. She built something over the course of the set, rather than delivering it fully formed at the start. And the result, by the time she reached the final song, was an audience that had been traveling with her for 40 minutes and was now somewhere they had not expected to be when the evening began. Somewhere more interior, more personal, more genuinely moved than the performers who had opened the show had left them. Otis Redding stood in the wing and thought about his set list. After the show, in the corridor between the stage and the dressing rooms, one of the musicians asked Otis Redding why he had changed the set. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I was watching Etta." And the musician understood, because the musicians on that tour had also watched Etta, and they had their own understanding of what she did that was different from what most people on the bill were doing. In the years that followed, Otis Redding continued to develop and refine what he did on stage, with an intelligence that the full-force immediacy of his early performances sometimes obscured from critics and audiences who took the emotion at face value without recognizing the architecture underneath it. His shows became known not just for the intensity of individual moments, but for the arc of the full evening, for the way a room felt at the end of an Otis Redding performance, which was different from how it felt in the middle, which was different from how it felt at the start. Whether the change that began that night on the touring circuit was the origin of that development, or simply one moment in a longer process of growth, is something only Otis Redding could have answered. He did not leave a detailed account of that specific evening, and he died in December 1967 at 26 years old, before the full arc of what he could become had a chance to complete itself. What he left was enough to suggest what the completion might have looked like: a voice and a musical intelligence that were still in the process of discovering what they could do, still finding the limits of the architecture and pushing them further. The recordings he made are, in this sense, not just documents of who he was, but evidence of who he was becoming. And who he was becoming was someone who had learned, among other things, from watching Etta James close a show on a mid-1960s package tour. Etta James did not know that night that anyone had been watching from the wings with that level of attention. She went off stage, and the show moved on, and Otis Redding went on after her and played a set that was different from the sets that had come before. She may have heard something of what he did from her own position in the wings or the corridor, or she may not have been paying attention at all. She had given her own set everything it required and was now in the process of recovering from having done so. The tour moved to the next city. The set list continued to evolve, and in the small, cumulative, mostly invisible way that performers learn from each other on the road, not in workshops or interviews or formally acknowledged exchanges, but in corridors and wings and the spaces between shows, something had passed from one artist to another. Etta James had built a room, and Otis Redding had been watching. And the next night, and the night after that, he built his a little differently.